Hello, everyone. We are the 3 Gigs, and this is a 3 Gig short. 3 Gigs is 3 guys in glasses. And we like to share our years of scar tissue and experience in construction to help educate all of you construction people. And so today we're going to talk about an RFI, or a request for information. And so with that, I'm just going to ask you guys, what is a construction RFI?
It's a document that is critical for getting questions answered between a contractor and a contractor, or a contractor and an owner, or a contractor and an architect.
And the important thing about that is that it has to be relative to either design or contract issues. So we would never use an RFI for logistical things like, hey, can I use the south gate for access on Saturday? It would have to be to clarify contract and design issues for the most part.
Right.
So
Right.
So it's a question to another member of the team. And it can go any direction. Most often we think of it coming up from the contractor base up to the owner through
Right.
the architect, but it can go in any direction
Right.
technically.
Now, so an architect could send an RFI to a subcontractor?
If they needed to, yes, for information.
Wow. I haven't experienced that yet.
I haven't
It
either.
is what you're saying.
I haven't
It
either,
is,
but
yeah.
it's possible.
Okay. So it's a request for information. So
Right.
when would somebody submit an RFI? What would cause them to say, I need to submit an RFI?
I had one just yesterday that came in where the contractor issued an RFI, and it said, we're looking at the drawings for the steel awning, and we can't find any way to connect the steel awning to the building.
Huh.
So what's your intention for connecting the steel awning to the building? Are there brackets? Are there knife plates? The drawings never got done.
So that's a case of something absolutely missing in the documents. We would also write an RFI if there was just a need for clarification. For example, if the spec section called out one thing, a detail called out another thing, and we couldn't find the clarification for that on the plan pages, we would write an RFI to try to get some clarification. Even though it was mentioned in one place or two, it didn't tie together, right, in that kind
Right.
of situation.
Right.
Yeah. Because a lot of times drawings are diagrammatic, or they might specify this product, but the subcontractor substituted, and so maybe it needed 3 screws instead of 2 screws, like
Right.
the specified product or something like
Another
that.
reason that I think RFIs are necessary is because think about what happens. You have an architect, engineer, the AE. They are tasked with designing the project. Well, that is their project. And so just like any contractor would come to the end of their project and have a punch list, that happens with the architect and engineer as well. They design the project, but they get to the end of it, which is our beginning of the project, and we're like that final walkthrough at the end of a construction project.
Yeah.
We have all these new eyes on their drawings, and we say, oh, here's a piece of blue tape. Here's a
Yeah.
punch list, right? Can you help us understand this? Because they had a very definitive amount of time in which to create these
Yeah.
Right.
drawings.
Right.
So most often it's not intentional. Most often it's not something that they're just inadequate, or we always as contractors try to just put the blame on them and impugn them. But most often it's an oversight, and in the same way that a contractor should have the right to get a punch list, a very detailed punch list, that's what the RFI does.
Kind of like in the old days when you asked somebody to proofread your letter because they didn't have spell check back then.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly.
Right?
Well, and so
age
a reason
age
not
us
to
out.
submit an RFI,
Yeah.
from my perspective as an owner CM, the reason not to submit an RFI is because you're too lazy to look at the drawings. I can't tell you, depending on the quality of the contractor, the number of RFIs that come in and say, I'm not sure what door you want here. And the response on the RFI is, look at page D5,
Yeah.
section 1. I just attached a highlighted, there it is.
Yeah.
And that happens a lot.
And that was very gracious of that design team member to actually write that.
It really
because
was.
they could have been completely justified
Yeah.
in just sending back an RFI or a response to that RFI saying one of the two dreaded answers: please see plans and specs, or please clarify. You didn't give me enough information to know where my documents are at fault.
Right.
Yeah.
Because that's really the essence of this. And so we have contractors that many times will just go back and forth 2 or 3, 4 times, being almost belligerent, not wanting to disclose enough information because they think
Right.
that the architect or the engineer should just be able to answer the simple
Right.
question.
Right.
So in a perfect world, how does an RFI keep the project moving forward?
In a perfect world, the RFI gets the contractors, whether it's the sub or the general, the answers they need to keep to the schedule. So if they're really looking at some drawings and they're not sure exactly what hardware goes with these certain kinds of doors, they have to order that hardware. That hardware is 3 months, 5 months, 6 months to get there. That timely RFI, if asked in time and answered in time, keeps the schedule going.
Yeah. So if I were to kind of move forward on this as well, let me ask you guys a couple of questions. Yeah, it keeps the project moving forward, but what about the RFI itself? Is there a more effective kind of RFI versus one that is not going to get response? So the only way that we can keep it going forward is to make sure that our RFIs are effective. So what are some of the ways that we can make sure we get their attention, first of all, and then get the appropriate answers back?
Right. Well, go ahead.
Well, one, I always encourage the guys in the field to write an RFI because you're a professional. If you're a sub and you're a glazer, you know glazing, you know the glass systems, you know the mullions, you know all kinds of the products that are going to work, right? Mm-hmm. So, and an architect has to know all of the systems, so sometimes he doesn't know it as well as you. So guide him to the right answer. So write the RFI that helps you find the solution that you know you need, but puts the architect's stamp on it, so that way
Perfect.
They're taking the responsibility for the answer.
I think it's important to write it, even though you're writing an architectural question to the architect. I think it's important to write it as if they weren't the architect.
Very good.
Because again, to your point, I may say something. So many times I'll get an RFI and I'll call and say, "What are you asking?" You've told me what you've looked at.
Yeah.
You've told me what's confusing, but I'm not clear. It seems like you've worked out some things, but there's something you're still looking for. The RFIs shouldn't be really long, and they should be about a thing. What is it you need to know?
Yeah, so
concise
first of all,
question.
Kind of coming back to that, one RFI for each individual question,
Yes.
unless it's completely related.
Yeah.
I would never ask about the glazing at the same time I'm asking about the pavement section out in the park,
Right.
in the parkway.
That's right.
The next thing is that RFI has to, again, be read by not necessarily a lay person, but almost, like Craig says.
Yeah.
So we always recommend having that question up on top in a very succinct way, but it has to be a question. Remember, it's a request for information.
Right.
So ask a question, and then if it's technical, like we have trades, electricians, HVAC, plumbing, some of the controls. These can be very technical questions.
Yeah.
But try to roll that question up and then put all the detail below. And then you can go screen upon screen upon screen or attachment upon attachment. But ask the question first so that Craig, right, the owner's rep, can understand it, or the first person in can understand it, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
Go ahead.
Typical flow, if you think about it, starts at the sub out in the field.
It does.
And then
Most
it
of them
goes-
start with the subs.
Has to kind of go through the general contractor. So somebody in the general contractor has to read it and probably rewrite it, because the sub has a form and then the general has a form. And so then it goes to the architect. And then it may go from the architect to one of the architect sub-consultants. So, it might be 4 people reading this.
Right.
So I think that's a point of kind of clarity is
Exactly.
key.
All right,
Okay.
let's think about mistakes that are made when writing an RFI. I remember a story, or not a story, a real situation where the architect wrote back to a general contractor saying, "We refuse to answer any more of your ridiculous RFIs." So what was going on with those kinds of RFIs that they were so ridiculous that the architect actually felt it necessary to call in the bonding company and see if they could get the whole general contractor removed.
I have had projects also where an architect has said, "I'm done.
Yeah, not going to answer that.
I'm not going to answer. I'm just." And what it is it's a lot of asking questions of information that's on the drawings.
On the drawings, yeah.
And you know it's tough. That's why contractors are contractors. You know, if it was easy, I'd do it. But it might be on this drawing. It might not be on this drawing, and it might be on this drawing, but in a slightly different way. And it might be on this drawing. You know, if it's a drain, it could be in the architecturals, it could be in the plumbing, it could be in the structural. It might be required because of whatever reason to probably be shown in the structural, but it's not there. You have to look.
Right. Exactly.
So when you don't look and you just go, I looked on this set, it's not here, where is it?
Yeah.
Right, so there's a kind of a simplicity to this as well, right? So the question in the simplest form that would get one of the two dreaded answers would be, hey, structural engineer, what material shall we place under the interior slabs of the building? I guarantee that we'd get an answer coming back saying, please see plans or specs, or please clarify, right? So I have to say, look, the detail shows this, the plan page shows this, and the specs say this, which is correct. So now I'm guiding them directly to a question.
Right.
To the question. Yeah.
Right. That is another thing. Again, just recently, it was a good RFI in the question. The question was very clear. It was the awning. We don't know what kind of brackets or connection points are holding up this awning. And then they said, see the attached. And you went to the attached, and it was a full sheet out of the drawings, with no clouds, no arrows, no.
Right.
Yeah, so just a full sheet.
They just threw in the detail sheet.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
It's, okay. But it said, we're specifically looking here. What are we supposed to do? And you looked at the drawing, and there were some notes about anchors. It was totally a good RFI, but that sheet didn't help.
Yeah.
It was like, you're just showing me the Grand Canyon now. Help me.
Tell me which one of these details you're saying.
Right.
Yeah.
Another mistake that comes into this equation a lot is that contractor who wrote that RFI waiting until way too late to write the RFI. And then the project is in jeopardy because this thing's going to have a tendency to go back and forth a couple of times, or the architect engineer is going to sit on it for a while. So we always recommend also priority systems. More importantly than that, though, is the day upon which we would need the RFI answered, because we have to consider the schedule, any submittal process that might come after. Maybe they would give us a new material or a new drawing, and we would have to submit on that. So we're going to put a priority and an actual date upon which we need that back.
Yeah, and another breaking point with the design team is when you're just getting RFI after RFI after RFI, and they all say, need by tomorrow, need by tomorrow, need by tomorrow. Right. You get so many of those, and even the owner starts to understand the contractor's not looking ahead.
It makes us look like a buffoon, right?
Right.
Yeah.
And most contracts actually allow the architect or the design team a certain period
10 days,
of time.
15 days, right? Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's more like the 5 to 7. You think about it in the field.
Well, the AIA says 10.
10, yeah.
Really?
And the AGC and every other contractor says 5.
5, yeah.
And then the owner has to get the two together and have an agreement as to
Yeah.
Can 7 work?
Yeah.
10's too long.
Exactly right.
And 5's too short.
Right. All right, so the next part of this whole RFI scenario is how do we track RFIs, and why is it important to track RFIs and to document the process?
It's so critical.
Yeah.
I need to see the RFI log just so I can get a sense of what's happening with the schedule.
Yeah.
I as an owner's rep or an owner, I want to see the log, not to dig into it. I've got designers, I've got all sorts of people who are making money figuring this out. But to me, the RFI log is so indicative of where we are in the schedule. And if we're really asking questions about something that we're doing right now, that tells me we're going to have a problem because everything is in the now only.
It's a great accountability tool, right?
Right.
Yeah, it's also in a good, with some of those project management software programs, you can track the log, and then you can see if there's a lot of, they'll like show them in red on your log. Right. These are the ones that are past due.
Pending,
and
right?
If you know that, hey, there's like 8 that are overdue, you can ride the architect to say, hey, look, you got to catch up, and you and your consultants need to provide these responses, ASAP, because the field is now being delayed by your lack of attention to these important details.
Right.
Yeah.
I have one more point to make, and then maybe let you kind of wrap it up here, Craig. But when you think about the RFI contractually, every construction contract, regardless of who writes it, is going to have some clause in there about notice provisions. They will tell you that you must notify your client within a certain time frame or as soon as is possible or practicable when there is anything that would change the cost or the time of the project. We normally start that process with an RFI. Mm-hmm. And so the fact that we want to stay in compliance with our contract ties hand in hand with writing good RFIs. It becomes a notification process as well. Mm-hmm. We can also use change order requests that we'll talk about another day for that same purpose, but most often these things start with RFIs. So we're literally using the RFI to fulfill that notice requirement in the contract.
Right. So along that lines then, with software and everything else, what, as a contractor, subcontractor, what are kind of the core basic best practices that you ought to approach within your organization? What are the 5 commandments about RFIs?
Earlier is always better than later.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, just flat out. We have to get ahead. You mentioned it earlier. If the owner is looking at this RFI log and every one of them says, I need the answer within 24 hours, what does that say about our team?
Right.
We suck.
Right.
So, yeah. So earlier is always better than later.
If you think you know the answer, put your suggested response to the consultant to make it easier on them so they can say, oh, yes, I'm sorry, I didn't provide that. You're right. I'm confirming what your response is.
Yeah.
I have a good friend who's a construction manager, and he came to the point in his management career where he wouldn't accept an RFI unless the contractor had given at least 2 possible solutions.
There you go. Yeah.
Wouldn't even send it up to the owner.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, and you hit, and we've talked about the importance of timing, but in terms of timing of an RFI, another thing that is done a lot of times, I see, we start to grow a log, and hopefully there's good communication with the contractor and the architect. And many times in our OAC meetings, they might all be read, but it's which ones do you really need now?
Yeah.
And the contractor, a good contractor, is able to communicate that, and maybe even in the RFI itself or within the system, to be able to say, Jim, I'm putting this in. You could wait a month to get me this answer. I'm just ahead, so, but this one I need to know now.
Yeah.
So a good practice is to actually work something out with the architects to where it's not all just boom, boom,
so
boom,
they can
boom,
expedite
boom.
when necessary.
Yeah.
I've started recommending that teams use the verbiage, a last responsible time for response is. Right? And the reason for that is because it kind of brings in the whole new lean construction dynamic that says it's just-in-time delivery of materials to the project, but also what about just-in-time delivery of information? If we give that architect, the engineer, the ample time to answer it, we should ostensibly get a better answer.
Yeah.
So that puts the impetus
Yeah.
on the contractor to start looking ahead. So we're really avoiding those 24 hours. And then the other thing that does is when we do come up with one of those things that actually did fall through the cracks, now the architect is willing to help us get that answer by 24 hours.
Right.
So,
So,
And one last best practice, make sure your question is very clear.
yeah.
yeah.
Right? Provide whatever documentation you need to kind of say, here is the point I need answered.
So, we kind of said it at the beginning, but to focus on why RFIs are important. What's the impact if the RFI process goes askew? What are the things that can happen in a project?
Well, why is it important is, nobody can prepare a perfect set of drawings.
Right.
So it allows the person in the field typically to just identify the small things that might have been missed and get clarity so they can keep moving, because time is money in construction.
And speaking of time, that is of the essence, because if the contract gives them 10 days to answer, and they take all 10 days and the answer is please clarify or please see plans and specs, then we rewrite the RFI, send it back to them. They have 10 days to answer that.
Right.
That's 20 days.
Right.
So
That's an eternity in construction.
Ugly stories I have all over the place where RFIs in that scenario just delay the project.
Yeah.
Now the contractor wants to come back and charge you, the owner, for your architect and engineer not answering promptly, and the engineer and architect is going to be looking at those RFIs and saying, we couldn't answer them. Look,
Right.
these were unanswerable questions.
Yeah.
So that's the high level of an RFI. If you want to know what they are, as Paul said, there's lots of stories behind RFIs, and we could talk on and on and on, which we probably already have.
Maybe we'll do that in a long someday,
Yeah.
if this is a short.
Right.
Yeah.
3 gigs, Paul, Jim, and Craig, and this has been RFIs. Keep an eye out for our next one. See you later.